Nearly every actor in this film had already played their part hundreds of times on Broadway, all except one, the woman who arrived as an outsider and walked away with the Oscar. That is only the first of many strange truths behind one of the most explosive films ever made. This is A Streetcar Named Desire, Elia Kazan's 1951 masterpiece starring Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh, based on the Tennessee Williams play about a fragile Southern woman colliding with her brutish brother-in-law in New Orleans. It launched a revolution in screen acting and survived a savage war with the censors. Today, we count down 15 weird facts and stick around for number 1, the footage hidden from audiences for over 40 years. Subscribe if you love classic film. Let's get into it. A Streetcar Named Desire began life as a Pulitzer Prize-winning stage play, directed by Elia Kazan, and when Kazan came to make the film version, he did something unusual. He brought almost his entire original Broadway cast with him. Marlon Brando as Stanley Kowalski, Kim Hunter as Stella, and Karl Malden as Mitch had all electrified audiences in the same roles on stage, and all three reprised their performances for the screen. There was one major exception, and it is a fascinating one. The role of Blanche Dubois, the fragile, fading Southern belle at the heart of the story, had been originated on Broadway by the acclaimed actress Jessica Tandy. But the studio decided Tandy did not have enough name recognition to carry a Hollywood picture, and replaced her with Vivien Leigh, already world famous as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, who had recently played Blanche in a London stage production. So the one performer who did not come from the celebrated Broadway cast, the outsider dropped into a tight-knit ensemble, was the very one who would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Actress. Jessica Tandy was the only original lead left behind. That tight-knit familiarity among the other three actors who had performed the material together night after night gave the film an almost frightening intimacy and ease, a shorthand between performers that no amount of rehearsal could have manufactured. Leigh, arriving from a different production and a different tradition entirely, had to find her place within a company that already knew the play in its bones, which only heightened the sense of Blanche as an outsider intruding on a world that was not hers. This is one of the most poignant and genuinely difficult facts about the film. Vivien Leigh, who plays Blanche Dubois, a woman unraveling into a mental breakdown, was herself living with serious mental illness, what would today be understood as bipolar disorder. The parallels between the actress and the tragic character she portrayed were painfully close, and by many accounts, the demanding role took a real toll on her well-being. Leigh had already found her earlier stage run as Blanche difficult, with her symptoms becoming more pronounced during that period, and conditions during the film proved harder still. She reportedly struggled with severe insomnia and emotional exhaustion throughout the shoot, all while inhabiting a character defined by loss, fragility, and a descent into madness. The line between performer and part grew heartbreakingly thin. It is a sobering reminder that behind one of the most celebrated performances in film history was a real person quietly enduring a genuine and serious struggle, and that the very qualities that made her Blanche so devastatingly authentic came at a real personal cost. A Streetcar Named Desire was a monumental success at the Academy Awards, earning 12 nominations, including a historic acting nod in all 4 categories for its 4 leads. And it made history with its wins, becoming the first film ever to win 3 of the 4 acting Oscars in a single year. Vivien Leigh took Best Actress, Kim Hunter won Best Supporting Actress, and Karl Malden won Best Supporting Actor. But there is a glaring, almost unbelievable omission in that clean sweep. The one member of the central quartet who did not win was Marlon Brando. His raw, explosive, revolutionary performance as Stanley Kowalski is today considered one of the greatest and most influential pieces of screen acting of all time, the role that made him a legend. Yet on the night, he lost the Best Actor Oscar to Humphrey Bogart for The African Queen. It is one of the most famous Oscar snubs in history. The performance that arguably changed the entire course of film acting went home empty-handed, while the 3 actors around him all took home gold. There is an extra layer to the achievement worth noting. The film's 4 leads were nominated in all 4 acting categories, a rare feat in itself, and the fact that 3 of them converted those nominations into wins made A Streetcar Named Desire a genuine landmark in Oscar history. In total, the film earned 12 nominations and won 4 Academy Awards, including one for its striking, atmospheric art direction. For Vivien Leigh, the win was her second Best Actress Oscar, both of them, remarkably, for playing fragile, doomed Southern women, having previously won for Gone with the Wind. One of the reasons the central conflict in A Streetcar Named Desire crackles with such genuine tension is that the 2 leading actors were, in real life, coming from completely opposite and even opposing schools of acting. The friction you feel between Blanche and Stanley on screen was mirrored by a real difference in craft between the performers playing them. Marlon Brando, along with Kim Hunter and Karl Malden, was a practitioner of the revolutionary new method acting, trained in the intense, naturalistic, deeply internal Stanislavski-based techniques taught at the actor's studio. Vivien Leigh, by contrast, was a classically trained British stage actress who approached the role in a more theatrical, external, technically precise manner in the tradition of her husband, Laurence Olivier. On paper, these two styles should have clashed disastrously. Instead, remarkably, the contrast worked perfectly for this particular story, with Brando's hyper-realistic, animalistic presence grinding against Leigh's mannered, poetic fragility in a way that perfectly embodied the film's theme of a brutish new world crushing a delicate old one. There was reportedly real tension behind the scenes over these differences, with Leigh occasionally frustrating Kazan by referring back to how her husband, Laurence Olivier, had directed her in the earlier London stage production. Kazan, a champion of the raw, new method style, had to find a way to honor Leigh's very different approach while keeping the ensemble unified. The friction was real, but it fed directly into the finished film, and the clash of two entire philosophies of acting became one of the picture's greatest and most enduring strengths. Given their wildly different backgrounds and acting styles, it is perhaps no surprise that Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh did not immediately hit it off. At the beginning of the shoot, there was reportedly some genuine bad blood between the two stars, though it had nothing to do with their acting. Brando was simply irritated by what he saw as Leigh's very proper, formal British manners and stuffiness. The ice was eventually broken in a wonderfully Brando way. The young American actor did spot on. Dead accurate comedic impressions of Vivien Leigh's famous husband, Laurence Olivier, particularly imitating Olivier's grandiose performance in the Shakespearean film Henry V. These impressions reportedly delighted Leigh and helped dissolve the tension between the two, and the pair went on to become genuine friends as filming progressed. It is a charming glimpse of the playful, mischievous side of Brando, using humor and a knack for mimicry to bridge the gap between two performers who could hardly have come from more different worlds. The title, A Streetcar Named Desire, has such a poetic, dreamlike, almost surreal quality that many people assume the streetcar itself is a purely symbolic invention, a metaphor dreamed up by Tennessee Williams to represent Blanche's ruinous desires. In fact, the streetcar was entirely real, a genuine part of the New Orleans public transit system. There really was a streetcar line in New Orleans named Desire, and it took its name from the street it served, Desire Street in the city's Bywater neighborhood. The route's destination was displayed right on the front of the streetcar, exactly as the title suggests. And the street itself has a history, having reportedly been named around the time of the Louisiana Purchase by a local plantation owner in tribute to one of his daughters named Desiree. So the hauntingly symbolic title, so perfectly suited to the themes of the story, was drawn directly from a mundane, real-world piece of city infrastructure. Williams simply recognized the extraordinary poetry hiding inside an ordinary streetcar route's name. The playwright had lived in New Orleans and knew the city intimately, and the geography of the play is drawn from that real world. Blanche's famous instructions to take a streetcar named Desire, then transfer to one called Cemeteries, and ride to a stop called Elysian Fields, were all rooted in genuine New Orleans place names, transformed by Williams into a haunting little map of the human journey, from desire through death to some uncertain afterlife. It is a perfect example of how the greatest writers do not always invent their most resonant symbols. Sometimes they simply notice the poetry that reality has left lying around, waiting to be seen. The music for A Streetcar Named Desire was composed by Alex North, and it represented a genuine turning point in the history of film scoring. North's work is widely regarded as one of the first major Hollywood scores to be deeply infused with jazz, a bold, sensual, modern sound that perfectly matched the sweaty, sultry, emotionally charged atmosphere of the New Orleans setting. It was hugely influential and is often cited as the composer's finest achievement. But even the music was not safe from the film's notorious battle with the censors. The production code enforcers were made anxious by just how carnal and sexually suggestive North's jazz score felt in certain scenes, particularly those emphasizing the raw physical attraction and tension between the characters. As a result, some of the score's most overtly sensual passages were reportedly toned down or altered to soften their erotic charge. It is a striking illustration of just how far the censorship of this film reached, extending beyond the images and dialogue all the way into the very notes of its groundbreaking, jazz-soaked soundtrack. Even the music, it seemed, was considered too honest about human desire to be left untouched. We are halfway through, and the strangest facts are still ahead, including a completely rewritten ending and footage the world did not see for decades. If you are enjoying this deep dive into a true classic, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me your favorite Marlon Brando performance. Alright, back to New Orleans. Vivien Leigh may have been the outsider on set, the one performer who had not come up through the acclaimed Broadway production, but she was unquestionably the biggest movie star in the cast, and her paycheck reflected that status in record-setting fashion. As a genuine international icon thanks to Gone with the Wind, Leigh commanded a fee that towered over her castmates. For her role as Blanche Dubois, Leigh reportedly received a salary of $100,000, an enormous sum for the era. That figure was substantial enough to make her, at the time, the highest paid English screen actress in the world. The gap between her compensation and that of the method-trained ensemble around her, several of whom were still relatively new to film despite their stage acclaim, was considerable. It underlines the strange dynamic at the heart of the production, where the Hollywood royalty brought in for her star power and box office appeal worked shoulder to shoulder with a group of intense young theater actors who were, in that moment, still on their way up. It is almost impossible now to imagine anyone but Marlon Brando as Stanley Kowalski, the role that made him a superstar and reshaped screen acting forever. And yet, when the part was being cast for the original Broadway production, Brando was very nearly passed over entirely. And for a genuinely surprising reason. The young Brando, still a relative newcomer to the stage, was reportedly initially rejected for the role because he was considered too young and too handsome to convincingly play the coarse, brutish working-class Stanley. On top of that, a veritable who's who of established Hollywood stars had been considered for the part over time, including names like John Garfield, Burt Lancaster, Van Heflin, and Gregory Peck. It was reportedly only through the persistent efforts of Brando's agent that he got the chance to read for Kazan at all. That single audition changed everything, launching one of the most storied careers in film history. All for a role its eventual star was almost deemed too pretty to play. Kim Hunter delivered a beautiful, Oscar-winning performance as Stella, the woman torn between her fragile sister and her volatile husband. Winning an Academy Award should have launched her into the top ranks of Hollywood stardom. Instead, within just a few years, her flourishing career was badly damaged by one of the darkest chapters in American cultural history. During the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era in the early 1950s, Kim Hunter found herself caught up in the entertainment industry blacklist. Her name appeared in a notorious publication that listed entertainers accused of communist sympathies or associations, and as a result she was effectively graylisted, finding film work suddenly difficult to come by despite having just won an Oscar for one of the most acclaimed films of the decade. It is a genuinely tragic irony, an actress reaching the absolute pinnacle of her profession only to be pushed toward the margins of it by political paranoia. The same shadow of that era would later fall, controversially, on the film's own director. Leigh Kazan, just a year after the film's release, testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and named former colleagues as communists, a decision that saved his own career while permanently staining his reputation and severing friendships for the rest of his life. So the story of A Streetcar Named Desire is quietly threaded through with the paranoia of the blacklist era, which damaged the career of one of its Oscar-winning stars and forever complicated the legacy of the man who directed it. Kim Hunter, for her part, eventually rebuilt her career and found a whole new audience decades later playing the compassionate chimpanzee scientist Zira in the original Planet of the Apes films. The overwhelming sense of claustrophobia in A Streetcar Named Desire is one of its most powerful qualities. As Blanche's fragile world collapses and Stanley's menace grows, the cramped two-room New Orleans apartment, where most of the story unfolds, seems to press in on the characters, trapping them together in unbearable tension. And that suffocating effect was achieved through a brilliant, deliberate piece of set design trickery. According to accounts of the production, director Leigh Kazan had the walls of the apartment set built so that they could be physically moved, and as the film progressed and the drama intensified, the set was gradually made smaller and smaller. The rooms literally shrank around the actors over the course of the story, tightening the visual space, heightening the feeling of entrapment, and mirroring Blanche's shrinking options and disintegrating mind. Most viewers never consciously notice it, but they feel it. an ever-tightening vice that adds to the film's mounting dread. It is a masterful example of using physical filmmaking craft to reinforce a story's emotional and psychological themes. The technique is all the more impressive because the film is, at heart, an adaptation of a stage play largely confined to a single small apartment, exactly the kind of material that can feel static and stagey on screen. Kazan turned that confinement into the film's greatest weapon, using the shrinking walls, the sweltering atmosphere, and the constant physical proximity of the actors to generate an almost unbearable pressure. Rather than opening the story up and letting the tension dissipate, he squeezed it tighter and tighter, trapping the audience in that apartment right alongside Blanche as her last defenses crumble. Tennessee Williams's original play contained a crucial piece of backstory that explains much of Blanche's tragedy and guilt. In the play, Blanche's beloved young husband, whose death haunts her throughout the story, had died by suicide after she discovered he was gay and reacted to him with devastating cruelty and disgust in a single, unforgivable moment. This revelation is central to understanding Blanche's guilt, her fragility, and her behavior. For the 1951 film, this entire element was scrubbed away. The production code that governed Hollywood at the time strictly forbade any depiction or even suggestion of homosexuality, which it categorized as a forbidden perversion. As a result, the reason for the young husband's death was made deliberately vague and mysterious in the movie, stripped of its actual cause. Audiences were left with a sense of some unspoken tragedy without ever learning what it truly was. A foundational piece of the play's emotional architecture, essential to its greatest character, was simply removed to satisfy the censors, and the film had to work around the resulting hole. The battle over A Streetcar Named Desire reached its most consequential point at the film's very ending, which differs significantly and meaningfully from the play, entirely because of censorship demands. The pivotal conflict centered on the story's harrowing climax, in which Stanley assaults Blanche, an event the powerful Catholic Legion of Decency wanted removed entirely, threatening the film with a condemned rating that could have destroyed its commercial prospects. Tennessee Williams, who co-wrote the screenplay, refused to cut the assault, arguing it was essential to the meaning of the entire story. The Legion then insisted on a compromise. If the act was to remain, then Stanley absolutely had to be seen to be punished for it on screen, because the code demanded that wrongdoing never go unpunished. And so, the film's ending was rewritten so that Stella, Stanley's wife, resolves to leave him at the finish, carrying her baby away from him. In the original play, she stays. This forced moral punishment fundamentally alters the bleak, ambiguous conclusion Williams intended, softening the story's devastating vision of how the world simply absorbed such cruelty. Beyond all its production dramas and censorship battles, the single most important legacy of A Streetcar Named Desire is what it did to the art of acting itself. Marlon Brando's raw, mumbling, physically expressive, emotionally exposed performance as Stanley Kowalski landed on audiences and, crucially, on other actors like a bolt of lightning. It was unlike almost anything that had been seen in mainstream Hollywood before. Brando's naturalistic method style, in which he seemed to genuinely be the character rather than reciting lines, made the polished, declamatory acting of the old Hollywood guard suddenly look artificial and dated by comparison. His performance is widely credited with fueling and popularizing a whole new generation and philosophy of screen acting, directly influencing legends who followed, from James Dean and Paul Newman to Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. The image of Brando in his torn, sweat-soaked t-shirt, bellowing the anguished cry of Stella up a New Orleans staircase, became one of the most iconic and endlessly imitated moments in all of cinema. The modern movie star was, in many ways, born right here. It is worth appreciating how completely Brando committed to the physical reality of Stanley. He had famously broken his own nose boxing during the Broadway run, and rather than diminishing his beauty, the slight imperfection only added to the raw, dangerous working-class authenticity he brought to the role. Everything about his presence, the posture, the mumble, the sudden explosions of violence and tenderness, felt observed from real life rather than performed, and audiences had simply never seen anything quite like it dominate a major Hollywood picture before. We have touched on the film's many censorship battles, but here is the astonishing final chapter. Even after Kazan and Williams had negotiated and compromised with the official production code, the studio, Warner Brothers, grew terrified of the Legion of Decency's condemned rating and its power to organize Catholic boycotts. So, in a move that infuriated Kazan, the studio made additional cuts to the film behind his back, quietly trimming several minutes of footage to further sanitize scenes. The Legion still found too sexually charged, particularly moments emphasizing Stella's raw physical desire for Stanley. Kazan was reportedly appalled to discover his film had been altered without his knowledge or consent, feeling genuinely betrayed. And the censored, sanitized version was the only one the public would see for over 4 decades. It was not until 1993, more than 40 years after the original release, that those excised minutes were finally restored, and audiences could at last see a fuller version much closer to what Kazan actually intended. Roughly 3 to 4 minutes of previously hidden footage was returned to the film. A genuine piece of one of the greatest American films ever made had been quietly locked away, unseen for the better part of half a century. The restored moments, though only a few minutes long, meaningfully changed the texture of the film, returning a frankness to the relationship between Stella and Stanley that the studio had sanded away in its panic. When the restored version finally premiered, audiences and critics could at last appreciate the film as something closer to the raw, sensual, uncompromising work its makers had fought so hard to protect. It stands as one of the most famous examples in film history of a masterpiece being quietly mutilated by fear, and then, decades later, painstakingly made whole again. So there you have it. 15 weird facts about a film where a classically trained outsider beat an entire Broadway cast to the Oscar, where a revolutionary performance lost the Academy Award, and where the walls of the set literally closed in around the actors. It survived a war with the censors that erased its darkest secret, rewrote its ending, muffled its music, and hid pieces of it for over 40 years. And through all of it, Marlon Brando quietly reinvented what it means to act on screen. Few films this troubled ever became this immortal. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who has never seen Brando bellow up that staircase. Until next time, always depend on the kindness of strangers.